So hello everyone, and welcome to Studio Salon, neither here nor now, with Adam Pendleton, Ralph Lemon, and Triple Canopy. My name is Nico Wheaton, and I'm the Director of Public Programs and Community Engagement here at the museum. Studio Salon is a pretty new program model for us. It's our literary society, exploring the intersections of literature and contemporary art. So tonight's program is presented on the occasion of Surface Area, selections from the permanent collection, curated by Doris Zhao, who's back there. It's an exhibition which explores surface as an expanded space of interaction, where the history of an art object or a body leaves its trace. Tonight we're also celebrating the publication of On Value, a multifarious book about the value of ephemeral artworks and the labor and bodies that make them. Copies are available, you probably saw them, but they're in the back, and you can buy one if you want to right here tonight. Adam Pendleton, On Value contributor and exhibiting artist in Surface Area, right there, sat in the middle. We'll be joined by choreographer and artist Ralph Lemon, who co-edited On Value alongside Triple Canopy. I will now hand the microphone over to Lizzie Feidelson, Triple Canopy associate editor, who will moderate tonight's conversation, which will be followed by a question and answer segment, so please just hold your questions until the end. Thank you.
Thanks all of you for coming, and thank you to the Studio Museum and Nico and Alex and everyone here for hosting us. So my name is Lizzie Feidelson. I'm an associate editor at Triple Canopy, as Nico said. Triple Canopy is a magazine, mainly online, that advances a model for publication incorporating networked forms of production and circulation, including public conversations, books, and, like I said, an online magazine. So we're here to celebrate On Value, as Nico mentioned, but also to talk more broadly about some of the many relationships that exist between live performance and published material. And obviously, if you know their work at all, both Ralph and Adam have thought quite a bit about this, some of these relationships. And so I'm glad that we'll be able to talk a bit about the book, but then also to discuss the way they've each treated the relationship between performance and published material in various ways in their work. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to the book, just to familiarize you with it, and then actually play a little bit of one of the projects that was involved. And then we'll talk for a while, we'll do some readings in there somewhere, and then we'll open it up to you. So yeah, thank you again for coming. So On Value emerged from the Value Talks, which was a series that Ralph held at MoMA in 2013 and 2014 as part of a residency there. And he asked a number of his colleagues and friends to give presentations about value in the museum. And there were a number of sort of animating questions behind the series, some of which were maybe more visible than others. First, how do choreographers relate to the art institutions that confer value upon them and their works? And when can the notion of acquiring a dance be useful as a kind of wager for thinking through the relationships between dance and museums? And why does this notion of acquiring a dance seem sort of seductive and kind of blasphemous at the same time? When can it be actually kind of a pragmatic question? And then also, how does the fact that museums have been sort of increasingly welcome to performing artists actually change the way that choreographers are thinking about the work that they do? And sort of central to a lot of this thinking, if not really explicitly stated, was the question of how artists of color have sought to navigate the power structures of the art world, especially when they find themselves at its center. So there was also some consideration of the historical preservation and treatment of the performing arts and the ways that preservation and documentation figure into assessments of value. So Ralph felt that the talks themselves would be best if they were private. I think he wanted them to have a sort of charge that they wouldn't if there was a public there. And then also there was a desire to stage these conversations sort of in tension with the museum itself, inhabiting some of the spaces that the public isn't traditionally invited to see. And I think he then also did want the talks to have a broader audience, which is sort of where Triple Canopy came in. And the book on value is really sort of an expanded record of the value talks. And actually I have a couple spreads of the book somewhere in here. Yeah, it's sort of washed out, but this is a project that Glenn Ligon did, a series of annotations in response to a talk that Kelly Jones did on Amir Baraka. So this book collects a lot of documentation of the value talks, but then also new responses by artists and writers. So it's an attempt not to retain the original intimacy of those conversations, but to, I guess, change them and bring them to a broader audience. So I wanted to play a little bit of one of the value talks for you. This was an event that was held in the Founders Room at MoMA, which I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's sort of like a crazy space. That's sort of the heart of the museum. There are these like big chairs in it. It was an event by Kevin Beasley and Fred Moten. Kevin is an artist and a musician, and he played a DJ set in the Founders Room. And then Fred Moten was writing a poem like alongside Kevin's set for about a half hour, and then he read that, and then they had a really wonderful conversation afterwards. And the conversation that they had is published in On Value, and then alongside an artwork and a short essay that Adam submitted in response. And then both the set and the poem are available online. And I should mention that On Value also comprises a series of digital projects on the website. So maybe we'll listen now to first a short excerpt of Kevin Beasley's set in the Founders Room.
Pulse is new in every instant. Is that still pulse? They be drinking and whatnot to the music. I had to wait until the picking was good, the smoke and everything. It's not a concertized thing. Can there be such a thing as a concertized thing? I be drinking and whatnot to the music. I be drinking and whatnot to the music. What not to the music? What's not to the music? What's not in the music? You had to be fighting not to play in these clubs, to leave the club in search of value. My favorite things are not concertized. My favorite things resist concertization. Concertization is like conceptualization of the title. Concertization wants to be concretization. It keeps coming out that way, as if it's a piece of the four hands, three of which are not trimmed. Dana Ward says that fun is the musique concrete of patricide. Concert music is the fun of patricide. Mingus wants to kill the Phantom of the Opera, to play the cello for all it's worth. Ain't no drag, ain't no thing, that done thing, that drag, the drag mix, is the mix a kind of drag. The drag is a mix of things, a disc coquette. One time I heard Marshall Allen's people beat the air, at which point transcription faded into document. So that's what this is, a faded aftermath of some little drumming y'all couldn't hear. There's a time lag between what I was playing and what y'all hear. This is a live in concert kind of thing, when the live is under erasure, faded out into vinyl, but what you're holding, as you know, is neither here nor now. I was playing, but you couldn't hear me, like you were Glenn Gould listening to himself underneath his mother's vacuum. It was probably the maid vacuuming, laughing at him having fallen into the sound well, where the sound can't get out of sound so he can feel, abstraction in between the senses. Got no values, nothing to say. To report out of the delay, this absoluteness, to rematerialize the phonic substance by marking waiting, to make you wait on don't make me wait. The homeless chorus what we are, how to love eviction in presence, which is other than conviction in presentness. Cool, well then I'm not your mother. Cool, well then I'm not your mother. Your mother is lost. Your mama is impossible. Your mama gone. How can you be somebody in the face of that? Why would you want to be? I don't know what time it was. I didn't know what time it was. Kiss some other chaps, my imaginary sleeve. Life was no prize. I need another minute. Let me take your time. It's nation time. It's beasts of no nation time. Value won't change you, but time will take you out.
Maybe you noticed that was actually Fred Moten reading his poem. I think I said it would be Kevin, but now I think maybe we'll listen to a little of Kevin's set. If this is the correct one.
Pulse is moving every instant. That's still pulse.
Okay, maybe this one is right. So that's obviously just a very brief clip of what was a much longer set. And a lot of the music that he used, something about it had some kind of relationship to placing some sort of resistance on the typical way that one might value musical performance, to put it quite broadly. I guess maybe now Ralph can do a brief reading if he would like to. This is just some current thinking. Here's some more spreads from the book. And we have copies back there as well. This is another a spread from Glenn Lyman's project, and this is another spread from an essay by Adrian Edwards, actually also in response to Kelly Jones's conversation. And now I'll turn it over to Ralph for just a little while.
So I thought I would disrupt the unvalued discussion briefly in the beginning. And again, the whole idea of value, I think, when I began thinking about going into MoMA and collaborating on Triple Canopy for this book was kind of a straw man. It was really this idea of I think the opportunity of kind of creating a container where text material could be performative and then sort of ensconced in the idea of something important. But really just about words as sort of an energetic material as performance. That was a big part of the idea as well. So when Lizzie was setting this up, she had mentioned that, Adam would be reading something too at some point. I said, well, I just wrote something, so maybe I'll share that. And it's not unrelated to any of this. There's just, I think, more to do with this really interesting generative conundrum for me of how writing is different and not different from performance, in the sense of, like, a lot of the kind of work and practice that I have and have been doing for a number of years. I won't say much about this. This lasts about 7 minutes. And you'll push play when I start, yes? Oh. It could be a forest if framed properly, the photo cropped just right. It sits a few yards away from Warren Carter's house, a fancy double-wide, almost a real country Rambler-style house, white, with a dark blood-red trim, a series of cars surrounding the yards, front, side, back, the field, a series of years to the models of the cars, 1970s to recent, white, maroon, and black, a Honda, a Dodge, an old Chevy, the cars and house and semi-manicured field, surrounded by thick, full green oaks and a few simple wooden utility poles with their overhead power lines. In the right side yard, a small maze of 40 to 50 young, thin Carolina ash, with one thicker one about 3 feet wide that becomes the center. There's a grassless red dirt dog yard a few yards from this center. Warren's son Chester is raising fighter pit bulls, 2 at the moment, one a terrified runt. The runt won't ever fight, but they don't put it down, not sure why. Maybe because it's weak. They are Christians, Southern Baptists, maybe that's why. They dress the dogs in silver spacesuits. Lloyd Williams, Warren's good friend, his wife Emma, put them together, patterned from pet store, bought large-size camouflage dog jackets. The runt's costume becomes a silver cape. She is engulfed. Warren and his son did the actual dressing, put the silver suits on the dogs because no one else wanted to get near them, not even near the cowering runt, not me at least. The dog houses were painted the day before, 3 of them, a shade of purple, actually a purple closer to African violet. I thought this would be an interesting comment on Klein blue, the color I was thinking about when I first saw the functional and quickly put together plywood structures. I'm not colorblind, but actually prefer purple to Klein blue. The structures badly needed a paint job, I thought. In my letter, I asked Warren to find any purple, a convenient Home Depot purple. Now bright cartoon dog houses in a 50-yard dirt perimeter with a slight heel and tiny sink indentations, not quite actual holes, but impending something more major. This partially recreated landscape is also full of fleas or chiggers, both I believe, jumping off woody plants or anything unplanted and moving, a queer patience, waiting for what? Waiting for us, the work. How did they know? We just happened to be there. I wear boots and thick jeans. I'm prepared, but it doesn't matter. I'm bitten up to my groin area. I go on the internet, investigating the marks and the pain, and discover that I'm not really bitten if it's chiggers. I'm burrowed through the skin by something and left with some kind of enzyme that makes the larger hole, a stylostome, I imagine, which causes red pimple-like bumps. Whatever they are, they populate my body for days, starting at the ankles and climbing upward, it seems. Terrifying. Then they die, I suppose, leaving larvae. The larva drops, eventually becoming mites, dropping to the ground, harmless to humans, laying eggs, and then the mites die, a second death. This is the theater, our forced and reconstituted dog yard, where Lloyd moved the flying saucer from his garage 5 miles away, still in Bentonia though, taking it apart after our celestial and countrified play 3 years before, when he first put it together and tried to make it work, actually fly. He said he would keep trying. He was able to get it rolling down a nearby freeway right away, an alternate lane. 3 years later, Lloyd took it apart, moving it in his truck the few miles to Warren's place, then repurposing it, circling it mandala-like around the 3-foot-wide center tree in Warren's backside yard with his bare hands. A voice off camera says, "Where's Walter?" Warren's father and the patriarch to this play. The story begins with him. When we last saw Walter, he had flown off in his flying saucer. Lloyd got it to fly. Walter wanted to go to heaven, where there ain't a lot of people, a chosen few, he had said. But Walter lands on what appears to be a futuristic barren cotton field on another planet. The saucer falls around a tree-like organism, maybe the same planet, but maybe not. The inhabitants of this place, ghosts of the R&B singing duet Sam and Dave, and their specter spouses, Emma and Lorraine, who on this day are elected nurses of the church, dressed in official nurses of the church white, find the saucer and plant an immaculate garden around it. They think it's a god. Walter is never seen again. At one point it began to rain hard, and they had to pause. Everyone soaking wet. Had to wait not only for the sun, but also until their costumes were dry to finish tending the garden for the camera. Rain and sweat. The rain softening the earth, making the planting easier. By sunset they were done. Lloyd turned on the flying saucer's headlights, everything else in dark shadow. It sat that way through the night, hovering. Lloyd remarked that he was tired and limped back to Warren's house. Silver-coated killer space dogs bark out high-frequency signals in the background. A garden, a memorial, a sci-fi requiem, not one's expected old black southern rage, reactive violence. Also an escape. It is our space after all. Search for a kind world, forgiveness, or forgetting. Imagine. Choreographed travels, death, which is also an escape. Down here, this South, like everywhere, funerals are theater. 2 years later, I received a text. Here are the pictures of the flying saucer. I'm sorry, Emma texting, sending more photos to me from her cell phone. 3, a close-up, and 2 long shots. Checking in after another great storm settled in the area, blew the tree down that held, centered the flying saucer. The only tree to fall in the little forest yard, completely uprooted. How strange. The saucer destroyed, a real wreck, sculpted by nature, magnificent, now a true, unfinished masterpiece. Lloyd and Warren used to work together, driving around, collecting good junk, and reselling it until Warren got too tired. How the saucer got made. Yes, progress, what the storm wrought. Back to junk, now broken to pieces in Warren's unkempt yard, uncollectible because it's already there. Waiting for what? It's just waiting. In Emma's text, she didn't mention how Lloyd felt about the damage, the obliteration, not a word, the labor. So I called Lloyd and said, "That was really good work, Lloyd. Thank you. I must get down there soon. We'll find another center, make something new, I'm sure. I'm absolutely sure of it. Though there is nothing idyllic about that place, where it is, what it represents, not even in my unreliable memory. There is the broad blue Mississippi sky, unless it's raining or there's a great storm. Clouds hanging in clumps, like pre-cubist snowmen, shapes more round."
Thank you. I'm glad you did that reading, because I had wanted to ask you to talk more about what you mean when you talk about words as energetic material, which I think has something to do with your interest in the lecture demonstration as a form. Can you talk about that a little, maybe?
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like I have a number of kind of materials sort of circulating. It's in a constellation of what I suspect is my practice or work, and sort of words and writing are one of them. And there's not really a hierarchy. I think when the unvalue or the value talks proposition came up at MoMA, I was invited to be in the space for a year and research. And that was less interesting to me than being in the space and trying to kind of activate something performative within the building. Because that's kind of what I do. And then it became an interesting curatorial puzzle of it shouldn't be me, and who would be interesting to bring into the space. And of course, so I thought about people who I know and admire, who write and read, and also I think about the writing and the reading again as performance, or at least my refractive take on what I know of them and their work. That performance element seems to be part of the work. And so it became just an easy, not so easy, but a more practical work of creating a container to kind of hold these interesting talks.
Yeah, you in your introduction to the book, you call yourself an initiating cipher for the talks, which I really like. Could you talk a bit about that term, if it's a term that you think of as a term, and then also maybe how that role differs from you as a choreographer?
I think of it as the same thing, really. It's composition. I wouldn't necessarily call what happened at MoMA via the value talks choreography, but there was certainly an element of instigating something, which I feel like is a big part of the material. I mean, when I'm more generally choreographing something, I'm working with people, I'm trying to initiate a particular way of thinking about something or a movement. Before there's an actual thing, the idea of designing some movement or something in space. It's trying to instigate physical or emotional reaction from a collaborator.
And then you write quite a bit. You published several books mainly of your writing. How do you feel then when you're writing? When you're how do you feel as a writer? Do you feel the same way, or?
Writing feels less fraught than the actual working with people part. I feel like I can disguise and lie more when I'm writing. It feels more fake somehow. And the fraught part is dealing with the rules of language, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like everything I do is sort of done badly, but earnestly. It's a sincere effort. And what I mean by bad is I feel like I don't really know or understand, or I'm not very good at the traditional rules of a thing. Traditional rules of how to make a dance.
You're bending them.
The traditional rules of how to write well, grammatically. I don't really understand grammar, but I know how how I would like something to sound. But I also, I think I mentioned at the Triple Canopy Gala gathering that for me writing is an act of trying to express how I feel about something, right? So I think of it as sensorial, and in that sense it's not that different from like how I think about the moving body.
Maybe Adam, can you speak a little bit about your writing practice, or sort of whether what Ralph is saying is resonant to you in some way? Because I know your writing practice and publication is sort of a companion to your visual art, or maybe that's not how you think about it, but maybe if you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, primarily I write out of necessity, depending on the project that I'm working on at any given time will necessitate that I write something. So, you know, if someone asks me to write something, I tend to oblige. But a lot of the performance-based pieces that I do are what I like to think of as language-based performances. So tends to be a script involved that structures the entire performance or performative experience. But there's also this aspect where I write to make sense of things that I want to work through visually eventually, or vice versa. I'll write to make sense of things that I've created that have exist visually. So there's a healthy dynamic between those two acts.
And you're soon going to publish a book, the Black Dada Reader. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. I know you have some writing that's going to be in the book that maybe you would like to read, perhaps.
Sure. But first I'll explain what the Black Dada Reader is, because I think it's always being discussed and no one quite knows what it is.
Okay.
So I was several years ago. I think maybe it was in 2007, I moved to upstate New York, to a small town called Germantown, which is about 90 minutes north of the city. And at the time I was literally in the midst of working on what, to this date, it was my first large-scale performance, evening length work, one could call it, called The Revival for Performa 07. The revival was essentially a reimagining of a religious style gospel revival where what structured the performance was a sermon, kind of an experimental sermon that moved in and out of different uses of language, from, let's say, Jesse Jackson to Donald Hall to Larry Kramer, to John Ashbery, etc. So it was kind of this conflated space, if you will, of conflating different languages or uses of language within this idea of a kind of religious style revival. Anyway, so I made this piece, and I was in upstate New York. I did this piece that, people took notice of it. And then I kind of wanted to disappear in a way after, having such a tremendous response to something that kind of came out of nowhere in one way. And I began to think very critically about how the other things that I make and do could create a space that was similar to the space the revival created, so a kind of performative space, a site of engagement, one could call it. And I started to think about how an idea can function as a kind of performance. An idea is a performative act. And so I came up with this idea of Black Dada. And Black Dada would, for me, exist now in the world as a conceptual idea that is defined through the actions that I make. or the actions that I do, rather. And so the Black Dot Reader it's kind of an opus that collects text that give a kind of grounding to how this idea could or does function in the world. And so it's organized in different sections, from foundations to language to artist positions, and then lastly there's a manifesto, which is called Black Data. And so each section has different texts from people ranging from W.E.B. Du Bois to Gertrude Stein to Joan Rotalick to Jim Jordan, and then it moves into collecting writing by artists on artists, from Ralph Lemon. Do you know you're in the Black Data? I don't actually. No one knows they're the Black Data Reader. No one's seen the Black Data Reader. So anyway, so that gives you a kind of a sense of what kind of content is in the reader. And it started off as a kind of a collage, really, where I literally made each page on my copy machine, and at the time it was spread all out and over my entire studio. So I was thinking of it as content driven in the sense of the language you would read, but also the way it would look and feel when you held it in your hand. So it was language as object and object as language.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the way that it's scanned? I mean, I presume these spreads from the actual, what will be?
These, we have more than this one.
Yeah.
Yes, so these are literally, these are the different spreads.
Yeah.
And it was basically, I was picking up books from my library and photocopying them. And then I would sort of collage them with by using Mylar, and so it's a kind of a visual collage.
Yeah, there's a nice observation in the introduction that it feels like a course packet in a way, which I really like. Can you talk maybe a little bit about your relationship to the photocopier, because it's obviously a piece of technology that's used to sort of cheaply reproduce published texts. Maybe you can talk a little bit about sort of the way, because I mean, many of these texts are new texts that people have written for the book, but then there's also...
Well, no, you're talking about the reader that's going to be published. The first reader did not have new text. It was all existing material that
Yeah. But I mean,
so just not
sure. But there is this action that you're doing of kind of performatively recontextualizing historical material using a photocopier. Maybe you could talk a bit more about that.
Well, for me, it's really a way to create a kind of illogical or experimental archive of sort of taking the book, putting it on the photocopy, and taking the text out of the book and putting it on the sheet that I can kind of manipulate and put in relationship to other things more readily than when it's sort of housed in the space of the book. So it becomes a means of me to take something from one place and to make it a tangible material, something that I can manipulate.
And it is the way that you, because you started off talking about revival, your performance revival, and is the way that you sort of collect texts to be used for that performance much different from the way you would collect text for the reader?
No, not at all. And I always say that the scripts that I end up writing for the performances are very much so a living document, and they kind of literally document the different books, poems, any kind of text really that I encounter from the time I begin to work on something to the time that it's finished. So it's a composite of time, it sort of documents time in that way. And that's sort of very much so how I worked on the Black Data Reader. There's a kind of an intuitive or random, it's anything but random. It's
not planned.
It's like a gray, is it random? How planned is it? I mean, they're heavily edited. it begins as a much broader space, and then it becomes a much more sort of refined one slowly over time. And that's the same thing when I'm writing something. I'm usually collecting and pulling language from many different places, reorganizing it, sort of using it to articulate my own thoughts by borrowing language from various sources.
Ralph, you also, use a lot of text in your performance work, but I always get the sense that the books that you've published alongside your performances don't come from the same body of texts necessarily, the way Adam's saying his work tends to do. Maybe could you talk a little bit about the books that you've published in companion with performance, like the Geography trilogy specifically?
Yeah, I feel like for me, I'm always working on these at least 3 or 4 different parallel tracks of a project. That one may have a performance base and its own research and its own kind of text-specific information. And then there has been another parallel book component to it, which, with the Geography trilogy in particular, or specifically, that was like a way to kind of collect all the research that had kind of gone into the actual performance. And then as a separate, or another one of those infinite parts of refraction of like how I've been working lately, then that documentation, which starts off as like trying to be factual, becomes fictive, right? It becomes its own sort of like unreliable play about material, and the material often in the books is the material of memory. Like playing a writing sort of puzzle with my own memory, and then letting what I thought happened kind of become the material, so that it becomes as much about being imagined as it becomes about actually happening. And then they become their own little sort of objects.
Yeah, I was thinking just sort of when we were starting to talk about the prospect of making a book, that you seemed very excited about the book as like an object that would exist in the world and like sort of deteriorate or degrade in some way. Like I felt like you would often mention that it could be dog-eared or get dirty or be kicked by somebody or something. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of your interest in the form of the book, or in the book as an object.
Well, I love how completely different it is from the actual performance essays, and how in fact, because there were responses, there were responders to the essay, so it kept refracting. And then there were those live elements, or the actual correspondence of the ask and the getting that done, but then the material of it entering this book created something completely other to me, and that's very exciting. And then I've been giving these, I've been doing these guest sort of teaching positions where I will give the on-value book as an assignment that students have to respond to get some kind of grade. And one student, I was just in Bennington, one student burned the book in front of me. And I thought that was really beautiful. It was very beautiful, like watching it burn, and that was really surprising to me. And I wasn't at all like taken aback or upset. I think she was really protesting the class. But I found the action like lovely. And then, but recently I asked her to send me photographs of it because I couldn't think about doing it at the time. I was so taken. And she never sent me a photograph. So I feel like that becomes really exciting to me, that it's just this other like temporary container for something that happened that's really different from what happened.
Right. Yeah.
And I guess it's that alchemic element that, it's very important.
Yeah. Adam, I wanted to ask you about something. I had heard you in reference to revival, say that something that excites you, I think maybe about performance specifically, was the ability to be kind of deliberately misread by other people, that you're, in part because the texts are being performed, that people might think that it's autobiographical, or they might like make some assumption about its source, and that that's something that you enjoy. I wondered if you could talk a little about that kind of misreading.
Well, I mean, I always wonder if the texts are being performed when I read the text. What am I doing with the text? I know that I exist even in this situation as a kind of performer, you know, so the language takes on a different weight and shape. But I don't know if I perform the text or if I simply read them, but people assume there's something performative about the reading simply because of the context and circumstance. So in that sense, there is at times a deliberate way in which I choose language that kind of will send everyone in the wrong direction, you know, something that is sort of explicitly false in reality, but might ring true, you know. So, I mean, you know, it's this question for me perpetually, since I do often borrow language, and the composition in its totality becomes my own language, as I understand it. You know, the script is mine, but the individual elements are borrowed, you know. So it does become this sort of tension between how I represent myself in that space as performer, as artist, as author. So those, they become very sort of fluid positions.
Yeah, and Ralph, do you associate because in your recent work, Scaffold Room, there were a lot of different texts that had clearly once been written and then were being spoken or sung by two different actors. Do you relate at all to that kind of misreading or misattribution of sources that can come about when texts are being performed?
Yes, I guess to a point. You know, I'm a fan of the mashup, Burleston, and I'm a fan of Kathy Acker plagiarizing, you know, material. I don't know, you know, it's like the stuff is out there, and it's interesting when it becomes a mashup or a collision, or, you know, a collage of a few different ideas by people who I admire and am moved by, right? So it's not random. And it just also seems to me a kind of sharing of something, and, you know, but yeah, it gets problematic if there's no permission with the borrowing. But it feels to me like it's maybe not about getting permission also, you know, that there's something that keeps it alive by just the borrowing.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, that seems relevant sort of to the Black Daughter Reader, and are you getting permission from anyone who's texted your scan?
No, Ralph has no idea for it.
Right, yeah.
It's like payback.
Yeah.
Now it is. It wasn't when I first. But I mean, those are such. You know, how does one get permission? You know, it's sort of.
What do you mean?
I literally mean that in the sense, you know, Gertrude Stein is dead. So, you know, how do I go and get permission? Who can give me permission to her work at this, you know?
Well, yeah, I mean, I know that or at least I've heard that this collection of texts, these scans, like existed as something that you were collecting, but, you know, not selling as a book, not publishing.
Right. Well, people only really care about permission if you're making money.
Right. And so I wanted to ask, yeah, sure, of course, and we know, and, yeah. But I wanted to ask you sort of about how you decided to like publish this as a book and what that means to you, since I'm not sure for how long, but for, you know, at least several years, presumably, it was circulating among friends.
I think at the time, I think to this date, there's maybe 12 copies of the spiral-bound Black Dada readers, and I think maybe 10 or 9 people have them. But there's a tremendous amount of conversation about and around the reader.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to this idea of putting an idea into the world, you know, and letting the idea itself become both the conversation and the thing that structures the conversation. But Black Dada became something that people began to comment on or about, and saying Black Dada is this, or Pendleton said Black Dada is that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that, so publishing the reader is a way to sort of insert myself more forcefully into the conversation about what Black Dada is or could be.
Mm-hmm.
At first it was interesting that people were commenting on something, of course, that you make up, you know, you sort of pull it from one place and put it in another, and it takes shape and people start molding it quite literally. And so the book is a means to, again, not to control the conversation, but yes, to shape it and to give it a different life. You know, there was sort of phase 1. The book could be phase 2, and then I will respond to the book existing in the world and the essays that are in the book that kind of speak to Black Dada, and in a more academic sense. I'm not an academic, you know, so I'm creating this kind of visual, textual object. And, you know, going back to that idea of random, you know, it's of course not random, and there's something very deeply personal about the Black Dada reader, because it's me sort of showing you the books that are in my house, you know, and the things that I value and give weight to, and sort of how these things can and do rub up against each other, you know.
Yeah, well, would you please read your piece, Black Dada, which I think is maybe some of your earliest writing on it?
Yeah, yes.
The sort of genesis of it?
It is. It's, you know, the thing is that when I first wrote it, it was something that was supposed to be read aloud, and now I feel like it's not something that should be read aloud, which we can see by the people leaving the room. So how is this, so I'll just read it. I'll read something from it.
Thanks.
It's a matter of fact, a full moon hanging in a low sky irradiates the day with a milky glow. Going in a taxi from the train station, now I am older and wiser. She was a unit in a bum space. She was a damaged child. The formal beauty of a back porch. And then somebody kicks off the lid. I need the gray-blue grain of western summer. I need the cardboard box of wool sweaters on top of the bookcase to indicate home. I need a very beautiful woman. Still, bell drops. When a work of architecture successfully fuses a building and situation, a third condition emerges. What Black arts did was inspire a whole lot of Black people to write Black Dada, Black Dada. This is Dada's balcony, I assure you. From there, you can hear all the military marches and come down cleaving the air like a seraph landing in a public bath to piss and understand the parable. I had a nice dick, average length and all. I wanted Ron to look at it, want it. Dada is our intensity. It erects inconsequential bayonets in the sumatral head of German babies. I need a very beautiful man. It's theological. It's a revelation. The grant is 800 euros. Need I cite Charles Van Doren on a stool and a greasy spoon? How are we to define this poem? What makes you think that's what this is for? What do you want for Christmas? Does it mean that if the universe is infinite, Then, in some other world, a man sits in a kitchen, possibly in a farmhouse, the sky lightning and nobody else up, and about as he writes down these words, I want the perfume back in the bottle. I need a prick in my mouth. I need an explanation. What did you think when they converted the funeral home into a savings and loan? Revolving door, dry blood, song of the garbage collectors beneath the bedroom window, seeds of the fig. White data remains within the framework of European weakness. The essence of architecture is an organic link between concept and form. Pieces cannot be subtracted or added without upsetting fundamental properties. We want coherence. She was a unit in a bum space. She was a damaged child sitting in a rocker by the window. I want Western movies. I need Monday morning, a prick in my mouth, and coffee. A cigarette and coffee for two. Primal soup, pineapple slices. Black data is a way to talk about the future while talking about the past. It is our present moment. A common doubt expressed about the practice-based researcher is whether they are equipped for competent reading. Yellowing gauze curtains. Remember the wedding? The raised highway through the floodplain. Regular communication by email with a commitment to responding within a reasonable time frame. So did I love this. The performer must not be credited. The performance must be done on location. Feet, do your stuff. Sigh and then breathe. I want a young man with long eyelashes, white wings of a magpie, red shingle roof. I'm unable to find the straw hat. How will I know when I make a mistake? Presentness, soap, we ate them.
Thanks.
Sure.
So when did you write that? And does that poem? Is it a poem?
It's not a poem.
Oh, sorry. Why not?
Yes, it's writing.
Okay.
Even though I might read it as though it's a bad poem.
Well,
it's not a bad poem and it's not a poem.
No, it's not a poem at all. Can you talk a little bit about how you wrote it?
I wrote that when I was in Manifesta 7 and I think in 2008, and the curator said, oh, will you do a performance? And I said, okay, sure. Was back then perpetually saying yes when I should have said no. And so I said that yes, I will do a text-based performance, and I flew to Europe without having prepared the text-based performance. Mm-hmm. But I brought all of these books with me, namely Ron Silliman's book, whose title escapes me, but it's from his alphabet, his collection of poems. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how, you know that work, right? So it's sentence after sentence after sentence after sentence, which was sort of heaven for me, because if you're looking for language, Ron Silliman is, sort of giving you all of this language in the form of a poem, one could say, or a text, an expanded text, expanded poetic space. And so I had that book with me, and I also had my own writing with me, my revival script, as well as a text that I had written for an exhibition that was about contemporary art, the civil rights movement. And I began to collage this language, but I structured it in a way where the language sort of had to function in regards to an idea. So what you're not seeing when I read is the text is organized where it goes from 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, up to I think it's 128 sentences. So from 1 sentence to 2 sentences to 4 sentences, and the text collects the language. So the first sentence is then the second sentence, and then all the 4 sentences collect all the sentences that came before it, but they're rearranged. So it was, in a strange way, a rather explicit way to reveal how I write, that, to collect language, but to kind of put the concept on top of the language, conceptual burden, one could even say.
Yeah, I maybe this will be the last thing before I open it up. Just sort of both of you have a quite vested interest in the wager as a kind of frame for a number of different activities. Maybe you could each just talk a little bit about how wagers or provocations have functioned for you. Or not, maybe. It's fine if not. I actually have a different question for Ralph. This is something that we were talking about earlier. It also has to do with provocation. There's a really wonderful book that your dramaturg, Catherine Perfetta, wrote recently. And in it she has excerpted an email that you wrote her, in which you're writing about a series of performances that you did without any audience except your daughter, Chelsea, who was videotaping them. And you had written, it's all documented and therefore provocative. And I just thought that was a very interesting thing to say in relation to the sort of performance and published material and the way that they interact, because I don't usually think of documentation as being provocative in any way. But you clearly do, and so I wanted, and you mentioned a little earlier too, like that you're really drawn to documentation, and maybe you could talk a little about that, the provocative.
Well, I think in the case of the living room dances, it was provocative because, or fraughtly provocative because it was not the thing that happened. Right? Again, it's like the mediation of the event, like the on values and the mediation of the performance essays, so they're not the thing. And if they're not the thing, then what are they? Right? So that's kind of where that's coming from. And as I mentioned to you, I'm fond of like saying and telling myself regularly I'd be a better artist if I didn't document. Like,
yeah, you said that.
Had these experiences and let them just be the experiences,
But why, what does that mean? Like, why better?
I don't know, it's sort of like, it's totally romanticized, but it's like kind of spiritually honoring the ephemeral quality of the performance thing versus the performance thing maybe being something else, or having the possibility of becoming something other than what it was, which I also, there's a sort of schizophrenia in that. Like,
right, but that's like your engine in a way, like that kind of.
Yeah, kind of. But if I stop the engine and think about the thing itself, what's so amazing is the thing.
Right.
The locus of all of this is about that kind of performance center, which can't really be documented.
Right. Well, I think that also has something to do with the audiencing of your work too. I mean, I get the feeling that what was provocative maybe about documenting the performance that no one attended was also, or what was interesting about it for you was that there was no one there, and there seems to be that kind of attraction for you in the performance being pure in some way because no one is there, or the right people are there, or something like that. And then the documentation can be its own thing, maybe.
Well, we also talked earlier about the Bachelard's Poetics of Space, where he talks about, the emphatic private moment in any creative process. It's really crucial, but at some point that becomes public, and how contentious that is, but also how inevitable and or necessary. And so for me, it's like, the rhythm of being in my rabbit warren and having to come up for lighter air, whatever, whatever's kind of calling that, like coming out of the darkness. And just trying to use that as a like in a creative rhythm that has to exist, and it's not necessarily like like something that feels balanced, but that is a reality.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's just like, again, playing with the rhythm of that.
Yeah, that's interesting, thinking about the relationship between performance and sort of its externalization in whatever form, be it in a form of documentation or publication or just simply being seen as a rhythm. I like that. Well, I feel like it's getting a little late, so maybe we'll have some time for questions, if anyone has them.
Just shoot your hand up and I'll find you. Or do something else, yeah.
Joe, that's the first question. So, really beautifully in both your practices you've been discussing today or this evening, there's this movement of language right between the spoken, the performed, the enunciated, declared, right, and the written and the published. And we've actually, when we've sort of talked about these two different registers, there's been in both your comments a bit of a kind of slippage about what language does and how it operates, right? At one point, Ralph, you said, I write, to talk about how I feel about something, and at the same time, you've talked about the kind of the archival quality of writing and the potentially fictive, quality of that, right? It's a way of reconstructing, however provisionally or even, clandestinely or deceitfully, the past. And likewise, kind of Adam, talking about the sermon, right, as a way of kind of reading aloud language. That's a kind of ecstatic form of communication, right? A sort of pure transmission between speaker and audience, or at least one can think of it that sort of way. And at the same time, Black Dada as a reader, right, is a course bucket for a field that doesn't exist except in the case that you've kind of been able to sort of summon it forth, right? It's a sort of retroactive, autopoietic history there. And I'm just wondering whether these two registers, right, which is one about the emotive, right, the expressive, which is one thing we expect from language, and the other about the kind of the authoritative, right, the official record of history, which is kind of print. I'm wondering if in your practices these are reinforcing and complementary, or in fact do they actually cast doubt on one another, right? I don't have to be too Derridian to think about the way that, the relationship to writing and speaking, contemplates our notion of expression, right, in terms of, performing language. And at the same time, I wonder, when you talk about the fictive, right, when you talk about, the way this operates as a course reader, are there ways in which this language's inhabitation within the zone of performance kind of undermines its claim to authority or, the official record or the impartial archive?
I would first like to say that, I feel as though any kind of documentation is provocative. It's just because it exercises a kind of control and it immediately becomes a frame, because it represents something, So that's always a provocative act, and good or bad. It for me, it simply is. And the writing for me is also a means of producing a way of producing documents through other documents, so reframing a document and creating a site of instability as to what is this thing now supposed to do. But also, it's not so much what I'm perpetually asking. I'm not saying that language, I'm trying to express something with language, or language is expressive, or it can be expressive. I'm perpetually asking myself, what can language do? What can it do now? What do I want it to do? How do I want it? How do I get it to do what I want it to do? But so it's perpetually a means of, sort of putting a question out there and asking it, sort of putting it out there and taking it back. But it remains deeply unresolved, and that's why I'm sort of uncomfortable talking about, you know, in a strange way about what I do with language, because I don't want to say, you know, this is what I do with it and this is why. I really want the actual act of experiencing the language to be sort of the way in which one understands it in the definition, if that, you know.
And I'm musing about your very beautiful questions. I use language, I think, to disrupt, or to complement my own play in how unreliable meaning is to me. You know, I sort of grew up a Jehovah's Witness, so I spent like all of my young life studying the Bible, right, as fact, as truth and fact, and then it wasn't truth and fact anymore. So to me, it's like the written word is amorphous. Like all of it is unreliable. So then, and yet at the same time, it has the like weight of realness. Do you know? Like, it is meaningful in kind of its meaninglessness. And you know, so as an artist, I find that like incredibly generative as kind of a material play, that like it can be real and not real. You know, like Deleuzian fictive, that kind of fictive. It's like that's being a human being, you know. And I was thinking Baldwin, I had this lovely quote from Baldwin, describe it, and he's referring to how one might be able to control the tyranny of the external, and I suspect what he meant by the external is just the power of the system one exists in. And so by describing the thing allows you some control over the thing. But what can one really describe, you know, when the thing is constantly shifting and not quite describable, and certainly not controllable when you're talking about larger cultural systems. But then I think Baldwin as a writer and as a, beyond his more, beautifully rageful essays, he wrote fiction. So there's also that sense of kind of describing something that is make-believe and creating that thing that doesn't exist that you can control. Right? So that's, I feel like, the kind of relationship I've taken on with language.
I can't miss that.
Huh?
I missed that.
Oh, I was just asking who that makes sense.
I can't help thinking about how the difference between in language as performance, the difference between reading aloud and from a page and not. Do you both? I know I'm not so familiar with your work, Adam, but certainly I've been exposed to Ralph and his reading, and with books all around. And so, do you take that into consideration when you think about language as performance?
That's a great question, and it's in one way seems like a small detail, but it means everything. And it's funny because when I saw Scaffold Room at Bard, your performers, when they use language, they don't read from the book, or so it's memorized, so it becomes theatrical in that way. Whereas I sort of very purposefully, when I'm doing a performance, I have the book or the script in hand, so that we're sort of, you're witnessing that I'm reading something, you know, so it draws into question again, am I reading or am I performing? And it was funny because during the revival, for example, I had the entire time I was reading from a binder that had the script in it. And at that time it was actually, you know, I just didn't have time to memorize it, you know. And then I realized that that was actually one of the most important decisions I made, you know, for how the piece would be presented. That I would not memorize it, but that on the, you know, the quote stage or whatever you want to call it in that instance, that I would, you know, sort of be going from page to page and making sense of this text in front of you, instead of, because I feel like when I memorize something and I say it out loud, it's as though I've already made sense of it, and it's going to be the same thing every time you witness it, because it's internalized and I'm performing it. Whereas when I'm reading it, I feel as though it more readily suggests that meaning is perpetually in flux, and this is process oriented, and and we're sort of both in the audience, and we're both trying to make sense of this language together. Yeah.
I also think it gives like the text an agency, so it becomes this kind of collaboration, you know, like.
Yes.
And Yvonne, I never told you this, but your invitation to the value talks came almost directly from your performance at St. Mark's Dance Space, how many years ago, where you were reading text. I thought, you were reading the text, you had a piece of paper, and I just thought, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And you know, it was just because it felt so kind of like human and felt but quotidian, you know, and I couldn't separate you from the paper and the reading, and like it had no center, sort of. And yet it was, again, totally emotional and sensorial, my experience in witnessing as an audience member. But it felt like it was sort of bigger than you and the text. Anyway.
And there's the distinction between the reading as performance and a reading to accompany a performance, which is the traditional association of text and, say, dance, or I don't know what I'm doing.
One of the more interesting things that happened with this Black Dada text is Will Holder, who's an artist, graphic designer, I think he still lives in London. He began to read the Black Dada text all over. You know, he would go to, if he was asked to do a performance, essentially he would read the Black Dada text, and he asked me, "Is that okay with you?" And I said, "Oh yes, of course, sure." And he asked me, "Well, are there any instructions, or is there a way in which I should do this?" And then again, then it becomes a question: is this a performance? And there were no instructions. All the information is embedded in the language, and that is the road, that is the map. Read it; it's yours.
Thank you. This picks up a little bit on the response to Yvonne's question, and I was really taken with the way that you're describing these collections of writing as containers and vessels. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you establish a kind of openness or architecture scaffolding to defining the space and the tension that exists between that and a maybe more overdetermined personal narrative that also seems to be evoked in the writing and the reading of these texts.
Well, for me, it's really important, and it's part of, I suspect, the choreography of it, that it stays unreliable. So it can't be the complete truth. That's just an important quotient for me. But it's also something that I don't have to work very hard at. It's like my memory is unreliable, and I just sort of trust that, and then that becomes the work.
I think maybe we have time for one more question if there is one.
Hi, thank you both so much. I think I'm interested in something to do with documentation as preservation, but also as this sort of lengthening of the decay of a work, or the decay of an experience of the work. Ralph, I like that you talk about your memory being unreliable, and all of our memories are unreliable, and memory is this very personal form of documentation that an audience can have of an experience that then decays at their own individual rate, depending on how old they are and their medical history and all of that. Are you interested in documenting your work to preserve it, however unreliably, but permanently? Or, as in when your student burned the book, is it just a way to watch the work decay over time? Sorry if that's terribly morbid.
I don't know if I'd use the word decay, but I'm really interested in the work continuing to become something else. But I guess ultimately that's about it. It's falling apart or disappearing. Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting to me. I don't know how to control that. So these kinds of projects become a way of, sort of, again, quoting Baldwin, describing something, or describing some kind of generative quality of an idea. I would like to believe that an idea can be infinite, and to be able to think about a way to approach a project, to keep putting in parts that help it become that.
Okay, well, I think we're about at the end, but I just want to thank you all for coming again, and if any of you would like to, we'll be going to Barrel Wine, which is around the corner, and having a drink. All of you are welcome to come. So yeah, and I think also you can still see the museum's open late tonight, so you can see the exhibitions on view if you'd like. So thank you again very much for coming. Thank you.